I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Eric Simonson, Managing Partner, Research Division, ensures that the firm's portfolio of research capabilities comprehensively addresses the entire global service space across geographies, services, and sourcing models. Rohit Aggarwal is a practice director in Everest Group Global Sourcing Practice, focusing on initiatives and engagement with shared services centers in the areas of benchmarking, locations, strategy, peer intelligence, and talent strategy. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Eric. Take it away, Eric.
Thanks and welcome everyone to today's webinar on talent in GBS. I believe we have an exciting session today. Those of you familiar with Everest Group will know that we focus just around the services space, whether that be business process, IT, or engineering. Obviously, a critical component of services, almost by definition, is that there are people involved, and getting the right people and the most out of them, and the right cultures and learning is a critical component to success. And that's what we'll be focusing on today in the GBS arena. Again, this important topic, we've got a lot of content. We'll be doing a poll midway through the webinar. We'll also, near the end, be offering a complimentary talent and cost assessment for enterprises that are interested. So stick around to learn more about that. For the structure of today's conversation, we're going to break it into three different pieces. First, we're going to talk some about what are our convictions. We have 5 of these. These are things that you may not find to be that surprising. In most cases, we'd expect that you would probably share these convictions with us, but we might have some new data or new points of color to them that you'd find interesting. Next, we'll go into 4 provocations that we have. These are areas where we think we want to push the thinking a bit on what people are actually considering, and maybe they're missing a few tricks. And then finally, we'll quickly share a few new ideas. So 3 controversies, some hypotheses and things we're wondering about, things we hear others asking us about, just to lay out what maybe some of the things we investigate further as we go forward this year. So starting with our first conviction, Rohit, over to you.
Right, so as Eric mentioned, the convictions may not look surprising to you. The GBS model continues to grow is not surprising, but what's our conviction is that the GBS model is now open for business. The key here is that the GBS model does not only continue to grow, as the data suggests, there have been significant new setups by both the GBS and the service providers in the last few years. However, the GBS, if you look on the chart in blue, have continued to increase the number of setups year on year. If you look on the right side, the data in green, what it shows is that in the overall global services market, the GBS model continues to increase its share of the pie. These are marginal changes, but gradual changes year on year. What has been the key reasons for growth in the GBS model has been the focus on business. If we look at the top 5 or 6 reasons, these include how the GBS model is now expected to create significant impact in terms of retaining the domain expertise in-house, impacting and improving customer experience for organizations. How is GBS expected to drive top-line growth? And of course, through all of this, drive more high value and build niche skills for the company. We'll talk about some of these in detail as we move on. If we double click into what exactly our GBS is doing, if you look on the chart on the left, what we see here is that year on year, the share of GBS enterprises or the GBS setups which are focusing on digital services, these may not be pure play centers, but focused on both digital and traditional, but the component of digital capabilities has been expanding, and the share has expanded to more than 50% as of 2019. Many companies have actually set up dedicated centers to drive digital capabilities because they want to drive a different operating model, a different employee value proposition, given the nature of work they want to undertake. We looked at some of the key technologies, and not surprisingly, automation analytics continue to be the largest, with several others in the fray. Let me talk about innovation a bit more. We'll look at what exactly are GBS organizations doing to drive innovation. And the ambitious GBS are driving innovation not only for the areas where they service, but they're expanding it and trying to become the innovation hubs for the enterprise as a whole. There are three areas that I want to talk about today. First one is data and analytics. There are no doubts that the data and analytics are becoming the core to organizations' growth and competitive strategy. GBS organizations are actually bringing a lot of enhancements to how do you engage customers better? How do you acquire more customers? How do you retain them longer? Other improvements you can drive in operations and many more examples. Many GICs have actually are already acting up as COEs, global COEs for analytics for their organization. The second one is technology and process innovation. GBS are largely responsible for driving a lot of processes. So they innovating in process is not entirely surprising. What is different here is that we have seen a lot of increase, a significant increase in the role of these GBS organizations, and many of them now housing global heads of many of these processes, global owners, and they are responsible for all people, process, and technology initiatives within a certain process, and that gives them a significant mandate to drive innovation. The third one we want to talk about is really focused on driving the top line of the company. These are the product innovation. Organizations are very strategically using the combination of operations and technology capabilities in the GBS and layer business context on top of it to drive new products. It could be customizing products for new markets. It could be cross-referencing their analytics, outputs to inform new product development strategy. Could be researching and providing go-to-market strategy on new markets. A lot happening in that space. We have multiple examples of leading global companies in this area. Next. Eric, do you want to cover the next one?
Yeah, so the next thing we want to talk about is the supply and demand. And what we see is basically misalignments, and we see this as a global dynamic. Next slide. So looking first at the United States, and this is statistics from the US government about the number of unemployed and the number of available jobs. And we see that interestingly, the number of unemployed has actually dropped below the relative number of jobs, so below 1. In fact, in 2019, there were only 80 people looking for a job for every 100 job openings, so less than a 1-to-1 ratio. If we turn and look at China, we actually see a little bit of a different dynamic. The ratio used to be 1.5, but last year it went down to 1.4. So still more jobs than available graduates, but yet a fairly considerable drop of almost a 10% on a relative basis. And if we look at India, it's a completely different story. Here, surplus of people and basically lacking the necessary talent for a lot of the roles. And you see this in dramatically skewed anecdotes. The Indian Railways opened 63,000 jobs and had over 19 million applicants. The Uttar Pradesh State Police had 62 messenger jobs and had over 3,000 PhDs apply for those jobs. And what this means is not that necessarily all these people are highly qualified, but rather for the available jobs, there's more talent chasing them than is really relevant. One way of thinking about unraveling this is sort of what's the relative maturity. In the US, it's a highly mature market, increasingly taking on a profile that looks more like Japan and even parts of Europe. Where basically we're starting to have a severe lack of labor. You see China now starting to mature itself, had some interesting demographic policies that are shaping this, but nonetheless moving to where it will become more labor constrained and certainly in pockets. And then India representing a lot of what we see in the emerging markets where there's human capital available that may not be entirely appropriately tuned to the market demands. So employability needs to come up. There's still large pools of people that can help offset some of the demand, some of the supply constraints in other markets. Next slide.
So if we take some specific skills and try to see what are the demand supply gaps across geographies, we are looking at the overall current supply of, we pick the top 6 digital skills, and we looked at the supply currently in US, and also on y-axis we plotted what's the demand supply gap. What you will see is that despite achieving high maturity in some of the emerging technologies like security or cloud AWS, in US, what we see is that there is still a strong demand supply gap to the extent of 1.5 to 2x, which are there in the blue dots. But once we layer in the India perspective, many people believe that India offers significantly higher base of graduates and the demand supply gap should be significantly lower. But if you look at the orange dots, what interestingly happens is, as of today, the supply of experienced and actually skilled talent in these areas in India is significantly lower. If you look at security, AI, blockchain, moving towards left on the x-axis, and the demand supply gap is significantly higher as compared to US. Again, relating it back to the point that India has much larger graduate pool, this clearly states that the quality of talent is overstated. However, if you look at skills like SAP HANA, you see that the overall supply in India has been significantly higher and the demand supply gap drops significantly. So once these skills mature, we expect some of the emerging markets to potentially scale much faster and the demand supply gaps in these geographies to drop at a significantly higher pace.
Rohit, I think that's a really important point about how these geographies that are still working to align their labor pools to market demands and increase employability. Basically, when there's new things, they will be somewhat generally slower to be able to respond. But over time, as they get the programs in place and people gain the necessary experience, then you can tap deeper into the larger talent pool. But it's a slower initial response, but a longer term wave of momentum. Next slide, please. Before I launch into the third conviction, I just want to remind people that if you'd like to ask a question, feel free. It's in the dialog box on your webinar interface. We'll answer some of these during the webinar at the tail end. We'll also follow up afterwards as appropriate. So our third conviction is around reskilling and upskilling, and basically this is something that everybody starts to talk about, and it's a great first response. But the reality is it's generally not. It has limits to how far you can push it. So necessary and required, but limited. When we define this, we want to be clear that you should be thinking about this as two separate things. We'll commingle these on some of the following slides, but when you're actually thinking about your programs for this, you need to think about it. Upskill as being taking someone to a more complex skill within the same basic area. So this may be going from something like, say, financial reporting to analytics. Reskilling is instead actually taking someone into a new area. So this may be, say, someone has been doing, advanced customer support in kind of a contact center environment. Can they move into like a customer training role? Can they move in to be a business analyst for apps development, et cetera? All of which we've seen, but that's an example of sort of reskilling, taking competency in one area and applying it to a new area versus going up in complexity alone. Next slide. We've now reached our poll for the webinar, and this will be opened up in just a moment, and we'll let you vote. But the basic question is, how successful have your organization's reskilling and upskilling efforts been? If you don't know or you don't think you've really pursued it, then please check that. If you think there's been some minor success, then that's great. Maybe moderate, something that you're feeling reasonably good about, or if it's been a major success, some real differentiator has really helped your organization. We'll leave this open for another 10 or 15 seconds, and then we'll close it off. Okay. All right. What we're seeing here as we look at the results is only 5% thinking that it's been a major success. Over a third is actually saying moderate success, and then another third aren't really sure what's happened or haven't pursued it. This is somewhat similar to what the data in our studies has shown, and so we'll go look at that here on the next slide. So we looked at this in a couple different ways. On the left-hand side was by function, and the right-hand side was by industry. And if you notice, the bars that are biggest, that had the most success, functionally it was contact center. Industry-wise, it was manufacturing. But if you look at the least successful, so the shortest bar on the left-hand side, or shortest bars are around IT services and next-gen IT. And the shortest bar on the right-hand side, industry-wise, is financial services. What I'd point out here, and I think maybe at least part of what causes the correlation, is the things that are best fit, the contact center and the manufacturing, tend to be in areas where things are a little bit more tangible, and it's easier to imagine what's next. So if the customer is asking this question, how might you route it? Or if the good is moving in this direction, how might you understand what's happening to inventory? By contrast, IT and financial services tend to be much more conceptual thought processes, like what could cause risk, how might something be down, and lots of different things can happen. It's not quite as tangible to think about. Therefore, context and experience becomes more important, and it's a bit difficult for people to take on more complex roles. That being said, the lowest success rate reported was a third. But most probably averaging roughly around half as being reasonably successful. Rohit, over to you. What causes these barriers?
Yeah, and let's talk about some of the practical challenges on the next page that GBS organizations have actually faced. Maybe some of you can relate to, especially those who are seeing low success or moderate success. The biggest challenge that we have seen is still a lack of clarity on the skills and competences that you're going to need in the future. As Eric mentioned, when it comes to some of the core operations in specific industry, specific areas in banking, financial services, or others, or even technology, there is still a lot of ambiguity on what the future is going to look like. So that becomes difficult to translate it into tangible skills you're going to need. This is difficult in technology, but even more difficult in operations in GBS context, because by the times the technology strategy pivots and it translates into what it means for operations, there is the next wave of transformation already starting somewhere in the technology teams. Another big challenge is that given the nature of skills that are going to be important in future is expected to be very different. Some of these problems have been solved to some extent, others fairly not. But who are the employees who are going to be your best bet? Do you invest in those who are top performers today? Or do you look for attributes like learnability or high potential candidates and invest in them? So mapping the current skills to future skills and accordingly investing who do I train for what is becoming a big conundrum. Apart from it, many other programs, how do you create bandwidth for your employees to undertake massive reskilling programs? How do you provide them clear career paths? Because this ambiguity is also causing large motivation in certain employee segments. And then, of course, all these initiatives require investments. So how do you justify the ROI? How do you measure in the short term if you're heading on the right track? Some of these continue to be major problems that GBS are facing, and we have seen some handle them relatively better than others. We can talk about that separately. Moving on to our next conviction, we also want to talk about from a locations perspective. talent is a global exercise. GBS organizations are taking a step back from lift and shift model, or call it grow where you can approach, and they're actually trying to make very conscious decisions on what role will different locations play. If we look at the market activity from last 2 decades, we looked at what are the top 5 locations that lost a lot of GBS market share and what are the locations that gained market share. So the top 5 locations which are marked in the red bar, India, Czech Republic, China, Slovakia, if you compare the market share they had for new GBS setups between 2001 to 2010 and then 2011 to 2019, they actually lost significantly. Again, the loss is larger for some locations which tend to have a larger base, specifically India, uh, but at the same time, they still enjoy a large base. The locations that have actually gained are the likes of Lithuania, Mexico, Israel, Ireland. The gains may again be smaller in absolute percentages, but are significant if you look at the total base they have in this market. I just want to clarify that it's not that India is not a preferred location anymore. It still continues to be the largest and most preferred location, given that it allows scalability in a diverse set of talent across different industries and different skill sets. But what we are seeing is GBS organizations approaching and setting up in new markets with very specific skill sets. For example, in Lithuania or Ireland, which offer very specific domain skills, in Singapore and Israel, which allow them technology skills, high focus on R&D, or in Mexico, which provides a good cocktail of skills to serve in the proximity Latin American region, or to the US. This brings us to our fifth
Yeah,
and last.
Yeah, Rohit, I was going to just add one point here. I think one thing that's interesting on the those that have gained share in the green, almost all of these are comparatively higher cost locations. And so as people are filling out or rounding out their talent portfolio and looking for these digital skills, analytics skills, R&D skills, et cetera, they've gone to areas that most of which are smaller, all tend to have fairly good to very good educational systems, and have kind of morphed their portfolio to have some of the high volume, lower cost locations, supplemented by some of these others. So it isn't that any one country wins in absolute terms over others, but rather it really is now clearly a portfolio design versus an initial selection of your first location.
That's a great point, Eric. Okay, let's move on to our fifth and last conviction for the day. We have seen that organizations have been trying to manage workforce in different ways, and one of the channels that they have adopted to either control costs or improve flexibility of the entire workforce system is to adopt contingent workforce. And we believe effective management of contingent workforce is a must for enterprises going forward. Let's look at some data from our research. We have seen that contingent workforce is gaining in terms of their share in the overall workforce. If you look on the chart on the left, many of the organizations have significant share of contingent labor. About 28% of the companies that we looked at had about 5 to 15% of workforce that was under contingent model. About 36% of them have more than 15% of the total workforce in contingent model. And this is really about a couple of points. It helps significantly reduce costs, especially in locations like US or other developed markets, where the cost of associated benefits, healthcare, etc., with the permanent workforce are significantly high as compared to the wage rates. And having a portion of workforce in contingent model really helps companies check this. But there is another important factor, is that the impact of acceptance to gig economy, retiring workforce is really starting to show, and organizations are able to have a better mix by adopting to contingent model. Let's move to the next slide. I want to share a really interesting piece of research. We studied more than 50 global enterprises and the way they engage with contingent workforce. And what we try to do is differentiate what are the practices of best in class, or what we call pinnacle enterprises, and how are they different from other enterprises. Two very notable findings emerged. The first one is that having a conscious alignment between the business strategy objectives and the contingent workforce strategy is a key to using this model effectively. 70% Pinnacle enterprises knew very clearly what parts of their business strategy are getting addressed by the contingent model. Similarly, a lot of these Pinnacle enterprises look at contingent workforce as a permanent talent strategy. They are not pursuing this opportunistically or sporadically, but they are having a constant approach to keep this in their overall workforce mix. That has really helped them derive long-term and sustainable benefits from this model. However, it has not come without its challenges. If you look at the next page, many of the challenges have been associated with effective management of contingent workforce. The most common ones are the likes of poor data visibility, or lack of the right tools. What we have seen organizations lack is to have the right technology systems that integrate and provide a single view of all the different workforce models that you have, an entire spectrum of different workers that you have. For example, does your technology system allow you to differentiate between the part-time workers that may be managed by a MSP from your contingent workforce model? So there's low data that allows you to kind of get the best out of different workforce. Uh, there is a second problem, the most common problem: integration into company culture. Often contingent workforce has been treated as second-class citizens. There has been a slight lack of acknowledgement from HR teams to really integrate the contingent workforce into regular employee nurture programs. Sometimes it's because they don't consider these roles to be important. Sometimes they have other, perception-related barriers to allow more access to these workforce. But many of them have actually constrained organizations from truly unlocking the power of contingent workforce models. We have this study, we concluded this study some time back, but those of you who are interested in taking this study and comparing yourself with other Pinnacle enterprises and comparing how you are doing, and then what are the some recommendations that we can provide, please reach out to us. We'll be happy to engage. Eric, over to you.
Great, thanks, Rohit. We'll now move to our first provocation for the group. With this, we want to sort of step back and look at the big picture. When we really consider talent, it's a multi-geo, multi-skill, multi-sourcing thing, and we think organizations need to intentionally be more holistic and integrated in the approaches that they're taking, and that'll lead them to good places. So looking now at our framework and how we think about workforce strategy, and this is to express what we mean by holistic and integrated. The first component is the talent strategy itself. And this is comprised of come up with the demand and supply plan, the sourcing model, and the location model. And in effect, what you're trying to do here is actually design for the population. So broadly, the hundreds or thousands, what do you want this to look like? How do you want them placed and configured? The second is looking at the people strategy. And this is all about engaging the individual to make sure that they are a part of what's going on and that they are effectively deployed, acclimated in the environment, developing, et cetera, so that you can achieve the overall talent strategy that you had in place. Both of these, I think, are somewhat conventional ideas and nothing too different. The thing that we think organizations are overlooking at this point is the third one, which is that there are actually a lot of levers that organizations can more proactively think about using to optimize the work itself. They can be thinking more clearly about, okay, how does technology maybe help me de-skill certain roles or improve quality, other things that may allow me to do things I wouldn't have done previously. We'll give some examples here in a moment. Similarly, they can be looking at analytics, not just analytics as the work, but analytics of the work. So how is work being done? How are people collaborating, et cetera? Those of you who use Microsoft 365 may have noticed they've started including a weekly analytics report to help you understand how you're using your time, who are you communicating with, et cetera. From my point of view, that's just the tip of the iceberg of what can be done to help people understand work and how to optimize it further. And then finally, there's a lot that can be done in terms of productivity and continuous improvement. Six Sigma has been a big thing, but beyond that, decreasing the total cost of ownership by increasing throughputs, by correctly configuring teams and ratios, by understanding what are the best practices that lead to more productivity, we think is still a very big area that's needs to be reapproached in a kind of world that's already been RPA'd and AI'd to a significant extent. So let's now look at a couple examples. So first, we'll take IT and we'll think about Agile. And if we think about this from a overall talent strategy, one of the first things that pops out is, hey, I need Scrum Masters. That's a different sort of role. I need to plan for that differently. Then also start thinking, okay, well, if I want to get the individuals and get the people strategy going, I may need a revised employment value prop because I'm more of a waterfall type brand. And I may need to organize differently. I may need pods to help configure how people are actually doing that work. But you're not done then. There's still the optimization of the work. I need to help people collaborate in ways that they have never done before. And I need to watch what's happening with new metrics, new analytics like story point, burn down rates. And all of these things need to be done together. Just because you try to move people around and create pods, or just because you train some people to be Scrum Masters, or just because you bought a new collaboration tool, none of them by themselves will address the actual opportunity. So again, this is what we mean by it needs to be holistic, and you need to think across how all these things interact with each other, and then you can get the speed, the agility, the productivity, the business responsiveness that can come from something like Agile. Let's now look at a little bit more commodity or contact center. We used to think of contact centers just being answering the phone. A lot has changed, and the work is changing as well. And we'll have a slide here in a couple moments that's, I think, quite interesting understanding of the talent markets. So if we look at the talent strategy, there's been a lot of channel evolution. That means the skills required are different. It's not always voice. It may be increasingly be social skills, chat skills, a whole range of things that needs to be planned differently. There's also a lot of different ways to configure the what it means for the people. Work from home models are becoming more viable. In fact, we just published a report recently at the work at home agent model and how that's being adopted in the contact center industry. There's also new ways to do learning. It's not necessarily, hey, we're going to put you in a classroom for 2 weeks, but rather maybe adaptive learning and how you interact with the interfaces helps coach you along the way. And then the supporting technologies. If you do it right, people can have more sophisticated contact routing to put the right thing in front of the right person so that they'll both be able to resolve it in an effective way, but also maybe they'll learn. And then further, you can use things like AI to help prompt on next best response, either to solve a problem, to suggest something to delight the customer, et cetera. So again, a combination of how do you plan the population to deal with things like channel, how do you integrate the individual in things like work from home and adaptive learning, and how do you optimize the work with things like the contact routing and the next best response. Again, all these things in combination become quite powerful. Used in isolation, it's not nearly as effective. Rohit, can you maybe give us an example of what we've seen with some organizations?
Yes, Eric. So what we looked at is that I want to share an example of one of the a GBS of one of the top 5 global bank, and what has been their approach to initiate their initiatives into building workforce of the future. And sometimes before you think about a lot of fancy things you need to do, more complicated initiatives you need to implement, it's also about taking a very informed decision on what you need to do and how. And what this organization decided to do as a first step, and this was not a first step, but after some many small failures, is that they decided to undertake a large scale initiative to map what they currently have, take a very objective view, and they did it by vetted by managers, a very extensive exercise. But they looked at not just what their employees are doing today, but what actually are the skills they possess. What is the proficiency level? What may be some of the skills they have that are not getting utilized in their current roles, but nevertheless they have those skills, and the organization may actually need them to in different role. They layered this with a very extensive demand forecasting. Again, this is a more of a ongoing exercise, but they did the demand forecasting for once and assessed what the gaps are, and then they kind of deep dived into identifying how do these needs differ by geography, by business units, by different teams. What all of this resulted in is, one, it not just helped create for the first time a very centralized and digital skills repository of all the different teams that they have globally, but it helped them take a very objective view to what needs to be their build versus buy strategy, looking at the gaps, looking at the expectation time that they have to fill those gaps. Can they really do it? Do they have the core foundational skills? What needs to be the reskilling strategy where they are building skills internally? How do they kind of personalize those learning experience? Where do they need new technologies? It helped them identify opportunities for talent redeployment, the stuff I talked about, employees having skills but not being able to use them versus other teams in the organization requiring those skills. They also, to enable this process, ended up establishing an internal L&D university to kind of bring all these programs together. Overall, pointing back to the integrated workforce strategy framework that I talked about, what this is a classic example of is how you need to tie different pieces of planning your overall population, assessing the demand supply gap, taking it down to individual growth reskilling strategy, and then using technology and using other channels to optimize the entire process flow. This is one of the great examples that we have observed. We've done some more research on the topic. Eric, you want to talk about some other recent research that we have done?
Yeah, something that I think is a great example. We just published a practitioner perspective about Societe Generale, and basically they were on a journey to increase their value add to the business. And a key part of what they did was to keep realigning their global workforce strategy across their locations, their skill sets, their new services, et cetera, to enable that value add. This is available on a complimentary basis if you'd like. After the webinar, when you get the document, you can click on the link, or if you go to our reports portal, you can find it there. We just released this, I think, a week or so ago. We're also releasing a series of videos that are interviews with Sunil Shah of Societe Generale, so you can look for those coming your way in social media and whatnot as well. But it's a really nice example of a sustained effort over a period of time that's really transformed how that organization is positioned. Let's go into the next provocation. So there's some good news here. A lot of the stuff that we just spoke about is hard. It's the big picture and putting all the pieces together, and you can't get there quickly. But we think there's actually one of the pieces of good news is that to some extent the markets for talent also help correct themselves. Rohit mentioned that in the banking case study that there were people who had the necessary skills that were in short supply, but they were actually in the wrong place, and just finding where those were and redeploying them was a big lever. We're going to look now at the next slide on actually contact center. And I mentioned this earlier that we come back to contact center. It's I think an interesting microcosm of how things are changing and stuff we wanted to think of as kind of low value work and a commodity has really started to change. What we did is we looked at the self-reported skills of people with contact center profiles in LinkedIn, and we broke it by what was their experience level. On the left-hand side, those that had more than 10 years experience. On the right-hand side, those that had less than 5 years. So we have sort of the bottom of the pyramid and the upper reaches of the delivery pyramid. We then also broke it by geography. The top row is in the US, and then the bottom row is those in geographies like the Philippines and India. And what you see is that everyone was adding in skills for, hey, I understand customer experience and I understand data analytics. Interesting, so kind of everybody's gotten the message that analytics matters and that it's not just response time, it's customer experience. When we look at those that are more experienced, the greater than 10 years, and we see that they were consistently trying to also look at customer satisfaction, which we interpret as a subset of experience, and also cross-functional leadership. Hey, how do I manage? And this was true across all geographies. If we look at those with less experience, we actually see that psychology, so actually understanding how the customer is thinking, was one of the more common skills being added. Very different sort of approach that you may not have expected. We also see that digital marketing was important for many of these. So both all the lesser experienced are seeing contact center as a part of digital marketing, and then those in India and Philippines are seeing it as a part as well. Interestingly, not making the list for the more experienced people based in the US. If we flip back and look again at the less experienced, we actually start to see technical skills coming in, things like Python for analytics and visualization, multitasking. So again, kind of a very expansive view of what skills are they trying to develop. And then finally, at some point, it starts to become very technical. We actually see cloud, whether it be for the experienced or less experienced, being something that people see as a key skill. And then finally, search engine optimization, again, a subset of digital marketing. So I think broadly, when you look at this, you see people who we may have historically wanted to think of as just a contact center agent, actually seeing how that is becoming part of experience, and that then changes into bigger things that require analytics, digital marketing mindsets, multitasking, search engine, and even cloud and other technical things. By contrast, you see those with more experience tending to focus less on that and maybe being a little bit less hungry to evolve to a next generation solution. Let's now go to the next slide and we'll cover our third provocation. We think that technology, as it relates to talent management, is woefully underutilized, and that it can be used to much more effectively address talent problems and even capture opportunities, and that organizations should be more innovative. We've seen, many companies, hundreds, if not thousands, of companies of various sorts, from startups to mid-size, offering some really great things. And I want to highlight just a couple here. I'm going to comment on just the first two at the top. So first one I want to comment on is Aspiring Minds. They're I think somewhere in the order of maybe 1,000 people. They do online applicant screening, and they do this across many job functions, from tangible skills to voice to cognition to even job simulations. And what this helps an organization do is to cast the net wider in a very efficient way. So if you know what you're looking for, you can narrow that pipeline up front much more quickly, and do it in with much more confidence, which is a huge thing as you think about the recruiting engine. The second one I comment on is Striver. They're in the learning and development space, and basically they use virtual reality to help accelerate how people are exposed to things in, say, operation scenarios, customer experience, and even soft skill situations. So maybe like the holiday rush in a retail store, an irate customer on a customer service call, difficult employee counseling situation, etc. And basically what they've realized is that people, often the hardest things for people to learn are the things that they don't experience very often. And so if you can use a virtual reality mechanism to accelerate how quickly people can be exposed to that, you can help them work through that experience and train themselves to recognize it and to deal with it as it comes up. Let's see, I guess Rohit, back over to you. Anything you want to add on this before we go to the controversies?
Eric, you covered it. Just one point I'll add is that things like Coursera, which are now very popularly known and seem very simple solutions, but some of the GBS organizations have been very creative in using them. And using some of the platforms like Coursera and embedding them into internal learning management systems or e-learning platforms has allowed GBS organizations to do more, do better quality content, and that too at a very lower cost. And this has allowed them to free up a lot of internal L&D team capacity that can then be redeployed into other learning and development initiatives. So some of these technologies allow you to do better, faster, but it's also about what can you leverage what's out there and not trying to reinvent the wheel internally every time. So with that, let me move on and cover the 3 controversies we want to put out today before this group. The first one is that given all the change that is happening in the ways of delivering services and agile concept evolving from within IT to an entire organization, GBS are not sufficiently prepared to deal with the disruption due to agile operating model. They need to think about how do they operate differently. They need to think about how do they structure themselves differently. It means different governance model. It means different team alignments, different reporting metrics, a whole lot of things they need to think about. The second one is that productivity can be the next silver bullet for GBS. In the last few years, there has been a lot of focus on process efficiency. Automation has been a big focus areas. Many of them are moving on to advanced intelligent automation. But how much are they focusing on improving employee productivity and doing more with less? That's going to be the key focus areas and can be a game changer. The third one is that GBS cannot create value in future if it keep tracking today's performance metrics. What this means is that GBS want to create value. They want to drive top line impact for organizations. But if the GBS leaders continue to be evaluated on their ability to reduce the cost base, improve KPIs, then that's not going to get them there. We're not saying you move completely away from these core metrics, but what the GBS leaders really need to also focus on in what's the kind of impact they're having on customer retention, what's the kind of impact they're having on new revenues, what's the kind of impact they're having on accelerating innovation initiatives within the GBS. So those are some of the controversies that we would like you to think about, and we would love to hear your thoughts on this. That's mostly the content we wanted to cover today. I'll take another minute and cover a couple of another things we wanted to talk to you about. In this session so far, we have alluded a couple of times to what we call pinnacle model studies. These are very focused assessments, both quantitative and qualitative, to quantify the performance and focus on both outcomes and capabilities of enterprises which are best in class. We call them pinnacle. These are very topic specific studies. We have done many of these on specific topics like RPA, talent, digital maturity. The results of those studies are available for those who are interested. Currently, we are doing one on innovation in GICs or GBS, and there are a few upcoming. So happy to help if you want to participate in some of these. As Eric promised in the beginning of the session, we also have a complimentary offer for all our attendees today. This is a special offer for all our enterprise attendees. What we are offering is a talent and cost check. You see 6 locations listed on the left-hand side of the slide: India, Germany, Mexico, US, UK, Poland, and then few what we believe are among the top digital skills: agile, cloud, security, blockchain, etc. What you can do is get back to us and select any two locations and any two skills, and we will share with you how does the talent availability for these skills looks like in these locations, what are the demand supply gaps, what's the cost of these skills, and give you good perspective about these locations and these skills. How do you get this? You can drop an email to either me or Eric or both of us. Our email address is mentioned on the following slide. Or you can also indicate your preference in the post-webinar survey and we will get in touch with you. That was mostly what we wanted to cover. With that, let me open it up for Q&A.
So first, Rohit, I have a question for you here. A reminder, there's a question panel in the webinar platform if you want to submit one. We'll get to that in due course. Rohit, you mentioned, and I spoke on it, and I know you have some points of view on it as well, that there's actually a wide range of types of technology that you could use in talent management. Plus, there's a lot of different types of functions. Can you talk a little bit about, what type of things you're looking at and what you're seeing in terms of what's the spectrum of possibilities and where we actually see adoption versus, where are people most lagging?
That's a good question, Eric. So you talked about some of the ways how our companies are thinking about new technologies, or GBS are thinking about new technologies in talent acquisition or learning and development. In talent acquisition, actually, organizations have implemented many more technologies. This is one of the more advanced area, both talent acquisition and learning and development, where we are seeing application of technologies like analytics, AI, virtual reality-based assessments, simulation-based assessments to actually find the target talent or the best suited talent faster, remove objectivity, and also improve the candidate experience, especially in areas for technology, R&D skills. Many companies are actually trying to test the actual practical application of these skills versus the regular interview process. In areas where it is not used as much right now is how do you enhance employee experience, which will play a big role in talent retention as the talent war intensifies further. But we are seeing some companies trying to think about more personalized career growth plans. So they are using newer technologies, again, based heavily on analytics and automation to improve employee experience. And even some applications of technologies like blockchain, but they are very nascent and very selective examples.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rohit. We had a question around do we have the let's see, do we have some of these figures in regards to the talent demand for Europe? I think this is referring to slide 11 and 12. Is that something, Rohit, that we have?
Oh yeah, we have for locations like UK, we have locations like Germany. So we can follow up on that one and share some of this information.
Okay, great. Okay. Okay, in this, okay, another question. Do we think, was Ireland near the top of the location slide on 19? Is that in any way related to Brexit? Has that caused people to be wanting to move out of the UK and into Ireland? To what extent do we think that's driving the increased market share?
I would say Brexit has definitely added to the increased market activity in Ireland. Many companies in UK and in many of them, several global companies, including the likes of Goldman Sachs, others have publicly declared their plans to move to other nearby locations, including Ireland. But this is one of the many factors that has driven the market activity increase in Ireland or the growth in Ireland. Several reasons, for example, strong financial services ecosystem contributing to domain skills, coupled with a lot of technology skills, and the availability of multilingual talent has really provided a very good cocktail of skills to serve European markets, not just European markets. In some cases, very global teams are also based. But Brexit has been a contributor, but not the whole reason for growth in Ireland.
Okay. This is in response to slide 33, which was in relationship to the controversies, and it is, Rohit, can you give, you mentioned you think GBS is fully ready for the impact of Agile, and the question is, can you give some examples of what you may mean by that? How might they not be appropriately prepared?
Oh yeah, so again, this can be fairly complicated point to cover. I'll try to simplify and cover a couple of aspects. The first one is, how are the GBS organizations structured? Do the operations, analytics, technology, all the different teams still operate in silos, versus what is the degree of integration that is allowed? Are they getting ready to operate in a more agile manner where they can focus on end results versus individual KRAs? Similarly, is the middle management used to working in a rapidly evolving agile environment versus the traditional way of processing a lot of tasks? So some of these changes, how the middle management needs to think, how the talent needs to be located and kind of structured different teams. So these are some of the ways. Essentially, think about it as agile is more of a culture that GBS organizations need to bring in, and this will have many tangible changes and many intangible changes that they need to inculcate. We can talk more about that. It's a very interesting topic. We can talk more about that if that's of interest.
Okay. All right, I'm going to take the last. There's a question or two that tie together. One is, are the insights here relevant to outsourced or only to internal? And then there's another one kind of around the business case. So I'd say many of the things within today's discussion would indeed also be relevant to outsourced environments as well, in terms of the challenges they're facing. There will be some things that are a bit different given the more direct commercial model versus the tight integration into existing organization. I would point out that many of the technologies and even some of the other practices have often originated with the third-party service providers who have seen a business case for getting people trained faster, for reducing the induction time frame, for being better able to predict which talent will move into the next role effectively. So they, because of the kind of commercial constructs they operate under, they've been pressured, and in some cases maybe a bit more innovative to try to find ways to drive productivity, workforce analytics, et cetera. That then ties to kind of the last question around business case and ROI. Some of these things may seem touchy-feely, but clearly there are some real ways to make the workforce both more productive, more resilient, decrease turnover. So would encourage people to try to really put a business case to these things and think expansively about that. That's something that we're intending to, over the next year, to increasingly be able to demonstrate, is how within talent you can have real business cases to help get finance and others that may be skeptical of some of these things to buy in. With that, that takes us to the end of our time. There are a number of questions we weren't able to get to. We'll look for ways to follow up on those afterwards. You'll receive a follow-up email after this with a link to download it sometime in the next day or so. Additionally, feel free to reach out to Rohit or I if you'd like to take advantage of the offer on the talent and cost assessment. And with that, thank you for your time today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Eric and Rohit, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. In addition, please be sure to check out Everest Group complimentary resources to access their current perspectives on talent management for shared services and other global sourcing topics. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.